I wish someone told me this before that night. Not in a sermon. Not in a long conversation. Just simply. So that maybe I would have paused long enough to listen. Because that one decision almost cost me something I didn't even realize I was protecting. And the scary part is, nothing about it looked wrong from the outside. Everything looked right. Everything made sense. Everything lined up. And that's exactly why I said yes. I remember where I was when his message came in. Sitting on my bed. Phone in my hand. Not doing anything important. Just existing in one of those quiet moments you don't think twice about. Until something shifts. Then my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. And there it was. Hey Deborah. I'd really like to take you out this weekend. I didn't smile. I didn't panic. I didn't even move. I just stared. Because something in me paused. Not outside. Inside. And it's hard to explain. Because nothing about that message was wrong. He was a good man. Everyone knew that. He was always in church. Always serving. Always around the pastor. If anything. He was exactly the kind of person you would expect to ask that question. So why did it feel off? I read it again. Slower this time. As if I had missed something. But I hadn't. And that's when I felt it. That quiet discomfort. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that doesn't explain itself. The kind that just sits there. And refuses to leave. I remember whispering, Deborah, why does this not feel right? And for a brief moment, everything went still. Because deep down, I already knew the answer. I just didn't want to accept it. I had just turned 27. And where I come from, that number is not just a number. It's a reminder. A quiet one. But constant. My aunt had said it casually at my birthday dinner. Deborah, you're next in line. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. But something in me tightened. Because it wasn't the first time I had heard it. And it stayed with me long after the laughter ended. Later that night, I found myself scrolling through pictures I wasn't really seeing. Engagement posts. Wedding announcements. People I used to sit beside in class. Now holding hands with someone else. Smiling into a future that looked settled. And I wasn't jealous. Not exactly. It was more like a quiet awareness. That time was moving. And I was still here. Still waiting. Still trusting. And I had told God I trusted him. I meant it. But trust is easy when nothing is happening. It's when something finally shows up that it gets tested. And Samuel felt like something showing up. He wasn't new. He had always been around. But now, I was paying attention. And the more I paid attention, the more everything about him seemed to confirm something I hadn't even fully asked for. People respected him. They trusted him. I overheard someone once say, Samuel is one of the most reliable people we have here. And I remember noticing the way he moved. Steady. Composed. Always where he needed to be. Always doing something important. And that kind of consistency builds something quietly. It builds trust without asking permission. The first time we really spoke, he helped me with something small. Something that had been stressing me out more than it should have. And he handled it easily. Calmly. Like it was nothing. I remember thinking, he's dependable. And that thought stayed longer than I expected. Then the conversation started. Small at first. Just greetings. Then messages. Check-ins. Nothing overwhelming. But consistent. And consistency feels like intention. When you've been alone for a while. Then one evening, he said something that shifted everything. I've actually been praying about you. I paused. Because now, it wasn't just attention. It sounded spiritual. It sounded intentional. It sounded like God might be involved. And that thought, that one thought, changed how I interpreted everything else. Suddenly his consistency felt like confirmation. His presence felt like alignment. And I didn't realize I had stopped questioning. I had started assuming. And assumptions don't announce themselves. They just settle in quietly. Until you start believing something you never verified. And that was where the shift really happened. Not when he asked me out, but when I started interpreting, instead of discerning. The more I thought about it, the more everything felt like it was lining up. Not perfectly, not clearly, but just enough. And that was the problem. Because it wasn't obvious. It wasn't something I could point at and say, "This is wrong." It was just small things. Subtle things. Like the way he answered questions without really opening up. Like he was present, but not fully there. I noticed it, but I explained it away. Maybe he's just reserved. Maybe he takes time. And I moved on, because everything else looked right. Then one evening, I mentioned him to a friend. Just casually. Samuel asked me out. She paused. Not dramatically. Just enough. "Oh, okay," she said. I looked at her. "What?" She shook her head slightly. "Nothing. He's okay. Just be careful." I frowned. "Careful why?" She shrugged. "I don't know. It's just a feeling." And that should have meant something to me, 'cause it sounded exactly like what I had been feeling. But I resisted it, because it didn't match what I wanted. I laughed it off, and she didn't push it. But her words stayed longer than I admitted. That night, I sat alone again, thinking. And that quiet feeling returned. Stronger this time. Not louder. Just clearer. "Don't go." I froze. Because this time, I couldn't pretend it was just a thought. It was firm. Settled. Peaceful. And that made it harder to ignore. Because when something is unclear, you can question it. But when something is clear, you have to decide. And I didn't want to decide. I wanted it to go away. So I started negotiating. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe this is fear. Maybe I'm just not used to this. And then another voice came. Quieter. But heavier. "You're 27. And that one landed differently. 'Cause it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about time. Expectation. Everything I had been carrying quietly. And suddenly, the decision felt bigger than it was. That's what pressure does. It turns simple choices into emotional battles. And I was right in the middle of one. So I stayed there. In between. Not fully listening. Not fully ignoring. Just delaying. Hoping something would change. But deep down, I knew something. And it didn't leave. When I finally replied, it wasn't because I had clarity. It was because I was tired of the tension. I told myself it was just a date. Nothing serious. And I typed, "Okay, that sounds nice." Before I could think too much, I sent it. And immediately, something shifted. Not loudly, just quietly. Like peace stepping back. And I felt it. That absence. That subtle drop in my chest. And I knew what it meant. But I ignored it. Because now I had committed. And it felt easier to follow through. Then to step back. The day of the date came. And I delayed as much as I could. Standing in front of the mirror longer than necessary. Adjusting things that didn't need adjusting. And then, everything went still again. "Don't go." Clearer than before. I paused. I really paused. Because I could still cancel. I could still walk away. But instead, I picked up my bag. And left. When he arrived, everything looked right. He smiled. Warm. Familiar. He opened the door. Polite. Intentional. Everything you would expect. And for a moment, I relaxed. Maybe I had overthought everything. Maybe this would be fine. But as the evening unfolded, something started to feel off again. Not dramatic, just subtle. The way he spoke about responsibility, about how people depended on him. "Honestly, if I'm not around, things don't really move," he said with a small laugh. And I smiled, but something tightened in me. Then, at the restaurant, I noticed more. The way he maintained eye contact, the way he smiled. It felt controlled, practiced. And when I spoke, he listened, but didn't really ask more. He just acknowledged and redirected. At some point, he said, "In relationships, the man has to lead strongly." I nodded. That's true. But something about it felt rigid. Then he added, "I already know the kind of woman that fits." I asked, "What kind?" And he said, "Someone who understands structure. Someone who can align. Not someone that wants to challenge everything." And it wasn't what he said. It was how it landed. Calm, but heavy. And I felt it. Then I asked him, "What does your relationship with God look like, really?" He paused, just for a second, then smiled. "You know how it is. I'm always in church, always serving, always around spiritual things." And I waited, but nothing deeper came. No honesty, no struggle, just structure. And that was the moment something settled in me. Not confusion, not fear, clarity. Because suddenly, everything rearranged itself, not collapsing, just revealing. I wasn't looking at a bad person, but I was looking at someone I didn't actually know. And then I became aware of myself. The way I was sitting, slightly stiff, the tightness in my chest. And then it hit me. I had more peace alone than I did sitting there. That realization didn't shock me. It just landed. And once it did, I couldn't ignore it. Because now, I wasn't trying to convince myself. I was seeing clearly. Nothing was wrong. But everything was off. And that was enough. We sat there for a few seconds after he finished speaking. And for the first time that evening, I didn't know what to say. Not because I was confused, but because something in me had gone quiet. Not peaceful quiet, just still. The kind of stillness that comes when your mind finally stops trying to argue. I looked at him, really looked this time. His expression was calm and confident. Nothing about him had changed. And that was exactly the problem. Because everything I was feeling had nothing to do with what he was doing. And everything to do with what I was finally seeing. I nodded slowly, forcing a small smile. "That's good," I said. My voice was softer than I expected. But inside, something was settling into place. Not comfortably, not easily, just honestly. And I realized in that moment that I had been trying to make this work from the beginning, trying to fit everything into a picture I had already created in my mind, trying to make him align with something I had hoped he would be, instead of seeing him for who he actually was. I wasn't relaxed anymore. I shifted slightly in my seat, adjusting my posture, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest. But it was there, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more noticeable it became. He kept talking, explaining his views, his structure, how he saw relationships working. But I wasn't fully listening anymore. Not because I didn't care, but because something deeper had taken my attention. Something I could no longer push aside. It was like a quiet realization was rising. And this time, I didn't have the strength to push it back down. I picked up my glass, took a small sip, just to do something with my hands, just to ground myself in something physical. And that's when it came. Clear. Undeniable. I don't have peace here. Not later. Not maybe. Now. Right here. sitting across from him. And that realization hit harder than anything he had said. Because up until that moment, I had been trying to make sense of everything. Trying to analyze. Trying to explain. Trying to justify. But peace doesn't need analysis. It either exists, or it doesn't. And in that moment, it didn't. I placed the glass back down carefully. My fingers lingered on it for a second longer than necessary. I could feel my heart beating. Not fast. Just present. Aware. And I glanced at him again. And for a brief moment, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel all evening. Acceptance. This is not it. And strangely, that thought didn't come with fear. It came with relief. Because the tension I had been carrying for days finally made sense. The hesitation. The quiet resistance. The voice I had tried to silence. It had been right all along. I exhaled slowly, leaning back slightly in my chair. And for the first time that night, I stopped trying to make it work. I stopped trying to see potential. I stopped trying to force alignment. I stopped trying to convince myself that something could become what it was never meant to be. Instead, I just sat there, present, aware, and finally honest with myself. Nothing was wrong. He wasn't a bad person. This wasn't a terrible situation. Nothing dramatic had happened. Nothing extreme had gone wrong. But it wasn't right. And that was enough. When the date ended, everything still looked normal on the outside. Polite goodbyes. A simple smile. A calm tone. Nothing awkward. Nothing uncomfortable. But inside, everything had shifted. And as I walked back into my space later that night, I didn't rush to turn on the lights. I just walked in quietly, dropped my bag gently, and sat down. The silence that filled the room felt different this time. Not empty, not lonely, but revealing. I leaned back and exhaled slowly, letting everything settle. Not trying to run from it. Not trying to distract myself. Just allowing the truth to be what it was. And for the first time since that message came in, I stopped resisting. I replayed everything. The hesitation. The voice. The way I had negotiated. The way I had convinced myself. And it became painfully clear. I was never confused. Not once. I knew. I just didn't want to accept what I knew. I whispered softly, almost instinctively, "God, I'm sorry." And the words felt heavier than I expected. Not because I was afraid, but because I was finally being honest. You told me, and I didn't listen. For a moment, I sat there in that honesty, expecting to feel something heavy, something condemning, something uncomfortable. But instead, what came was something I didn't expect. Peace. Quiet. Steady. Gentle peace. Not the kind that ignores what happened, but the kind that reminds you that you're still held, even when you get it wrong. And that moment changed something in me. Because I realized, God correcting me was not Him rejecting me. It was Him bringing me back into alignment. It was Him showing me that His voice had been right all along, and that I could trust it, even when it didn't match what I wanted in the moment. Looking back, I could see how subtle everything had been. There was no obvious red flag, no dramatic warning, nothing I could easily explain to someone else. And that was exactly why it was so easy to ignore. Because we're used to looking for what is clearly wrong. But not everything that is wrong for you will look wrong on the surface. Sometimes, it just won't sit right. And that has to be enough. I also had to confront something deeper. This wasn't just about Samuel. It was about pressure. About turning 27. About feeling like time was moving, and I was still standing still. About watching others move forward, while I stayed in the same place. And without realizing it, I had started measuring God's timing against my expectations. And that's a dangerous place to be. Because not everything that shows up is sent by God. And not everything that looks right is right for you. I learned that peace is not something you argue with. You don't explain it away. You don't negotiate with it. You don't override it. Just because everything else looks good. If peace is missing, that absence is speaking. And ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It just delays the moment you'll have to face it again. I learned that proximity to God is not intimacy with God. Just because someone is around spiritual things doesn't mean they are aligned in the way you need. And maybe the hardest lesson of all, I learned that I am capable of ignoring what I know is right. If I'm not careful, not because I don't love God, but because I'm human. And if I don't surrender my desires, my expectations, my timeline, they will start speaking louder than his voice. And as I sat there, letting all of that settle, I realized something else I hadn't paid attention to before. Something quiet, but important. Nothing had to go wrong for me to walk away. Nothing had to break. Nothing had to fall apart. There didn't have to be a dramatic ending for me to recognize that something wasn't meant to continue. And that was new for me, because I think for a long time, I had been conditioned to wait for something obvious, something clear, something I could point to and say, this is why. But that night taught me that sometimes the reason is simply peace, or the lack of it. And that is more than enough. I thought about how many people stay longer than they should, not because they don't feel that hesitation, but because they're waiting for a stronger reason to leave. Something that justifies their decision, not just to themselves, but to everyone else. And in doing that, they ignore the one thing that was meant to guide them from the beginning. That quiet, steady awareness. That doesn't need to explain itself to be valid. And I understood in that moment that I didn't need permission to trust what I felt in my spirit. I didn't need to prove it. I didn't need to defend it. I just needed to honor it. And that realization brought a kind of freedom I hadn't felt before. Because it meant I didn't have to force things just because they looked right. I didn't have to keep going just because I had already started. I didn't have to explain myself into staying somewhere I didn't feel at peace. I could simply choose alignment, even if it didn't make sense to anyone else. Even if it meant stepping back into a season that felt familiar. Even if it meant waiting a little longer than I had hoped. Because now I understood something deeper. Waiting with peace is always better than moving forward with tension, even if that movement looks like progress on the outside. Because progress that is not aligned will eventually create a kind of pressure you cannot sustain. And I would rather be in a place of quiet trust than in a situation where I constantly have to convince myself that everything is okay. I also realized that I needed to be more honest with myself going forward. Not just about what I feel, but about why I feel it. Because that night exposed something I hadn't fully acknowledged before. The subtle ways pressure had been influencing my decisions. The quiet comparison. The internal timeline. The feeling that I needed to catch up. And once I saw that clearly, I understood how easily it could distort my discernment if I wasn't careful. How it could make something feel right, simply because it came at the right time, even if it wasn't the right thing. And that's something I had to confront. Not with guilt, but with awareness. Because it's one thing to hear God, and another thing to hear Him clearly, without interference from your own expectations. I realized that if I truly wanted to follow His leading, I had to be willing to surrender not just my actions, but my timing, my desires, and the way I imagined things would happen. Because holding on to those too tightly would always make it harder to recognize His voice when it came quietly. So now, I approach things differently. Not perfectly, not without questions, but with more attention, more willingness to pause, more openness to walk away when something doesn't sit right, even if I can't explain it fully. Because I've learned that understanding often comes after obedience, not before it. And if I wait to understand everything before I respond, I will miss moments that require simple trust. And if there's one thing I would say to anyone listening to this, it's this: don't ignore what your spirit is telling you. Just because your situation looks good, don't talk yourself into something. Just because it fits the picture you've been waiting for, don't silence that quiet hesitation. Just because you can't explain it. Because sometimes, that is the very thing protecting you from something you don't need to experience to learn from. You don't have to go through everything to gain wisdom. Some lessons come from listening, from trusting, from choosing alignment early, instead of trying to correct things later. And that is a much lighter path to walk. One that doesn't require you to carry unnecessary weight, just to arrive at a truth you already sensed from the beginning. That night didn't end with answers, but it gave me something better. It gave me awareness that I can carry into every decision moving forward. It gave me a clearer understanding of how God speaks to me, and it gave me the confidence to trust that voice, even when it doesn't come with explanations, even when it doesn't match what I was hoping for. Because I now know that His direction, no matter how quiet, is always leading me towards something better than what I might be trying to hold on to. And that changes everything. Because it means I don't have to be afraid of missing out. I don't have to rush into things out of pressure. I don't have to force something just because it looks like an opportunity. I can move with peace. I can choose with clarity. And I can trust that what is truly meant for me will not require me to ignore what God is clearly telling me. And in that, I've found something more valuable than getting it right every time. I've found a way to stay aligned, to stay grounded, and to move forward with a kind of confidence that isn't based on circumstances, but on trust. And that is something I wouldn't trade for anything, not even something that looks right on the surface. Because I've learned that what is right for you will not ask you to silence your peace just to hold on to it. That night didn't ruin me, but it corrected me. And sometimes, that's exactly what we need. Not a dramatic fall, just a quiet moment that shows us where we stopped listening and reminds us to start again. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for being patient with me, even when I don't listen the first time. Thank you for speaking, even in quiet ways that are easy to miss if I'm not paying attention. Forgive me for the moments I choose my own understanding over your voice. Forgive me for the times I try to force what you never gave me, just because I feel behind or afraid. Teach me to trust you more than my feelings. Teach me to recognize your peace and to honor it when it comes. Give me the courage to walk away from anything that takes me out of alignment with you, even when it looks right on the outside. And help me to wait patiently, faithfully, for what you have truly prepared for me. Keep my heart soft, keep my spirit sensitive, and remind me always that obedience is not a burden. It is protection. In Jesus' name, amen.